This is China and the World, hosted by Asia Society Switzerland.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the sixth and final episode of China and the World, where we are looking at the evolving role of China in different regions and countries. I'm your host, Nico Luchsinger. Before we start, we are already hard at work for our second podcast season, which will launch later this year. If you liked this season, please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. And if you'd like to support us, please consider becoming a member of Asia Society Switzerland. More information is on our website. Thank you. In this final episode of China and the World, we will talk about what makes Switzerland's relationship with China so special, why the country really needs a China strategy, and how Switzerland can increase its China competence. Switzerland has always prided itself for a deep and special connection to China. Recently, the country has published its official China strategy, the first time Switzerland has a strategy document aimed at a single country. The strategy has been intensely discussed, both in Switzerland and elsewhere. To talk about the Swiss-Chinese relationship and the goals of the Swiss-China strategy, I'm thrilled to be joined today by Ambassador Raphael Naegeli, who is the head of the Asia-Pacific division at Switzerland's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. His division had the lead on developing the China strategy. Raphael Naegeli, thank you very much for joining us today.
Nico Luchsinger, many thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I want to start here. One thing that I think we hear a lot is that Switzerland and China have a special relationship. What, in your view, made this relationship special in the past over the last decades, and how is it still special today?
I think 3 points I should mention here. First of it, I think Switzerland has always tried hard to be a pioneer in its relationship with China. In the 50s, Switzerland was among the first Western countries to recognize the People's Republic of China. In the 80s, when the Chinese economy was opening up, Swiss companies were among the first ones to make use, to profit from these new opportunities. You might remember Schindler was the first Western companies to establish a joint venture with a Chinese company in Shanghai in the 80s. 1991, 2 years after the bloody crackdown on Tiananmen Square, Switzerland was among the first countries to establish a human rights dialogue with China. So to establish a new constructive tool to react to these new developments. And in 2013, Switzerland was the first European country to have a free trade agreement with China. So I think Switzerland in the last decades has several times played a role as a pioneer in having new, constructive and innovative relationships with this country that is different from European countries. A second element I have to mention, the relationship between Switzerland and China is quite intense and is very broad. China is our third economic partner worldwide. All 7 departments of the Swiss government do have a relationship with China. We have more than 30 different dialogues ongoing on different topics. But not only the federal government has a close relationship, also a number of cantons, of cities, of universities, of civil society organizations do have partnerships with Chinese institutions and entities. So it's a very broad network of relationships that exists. Our foreign minister has a yearly dialogue with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China. So the relationships between our two countries have a level and intensity. There are few non-European countries that we follow so closely. That has to do with size, obviously, but also has to do with a mutual interest to establish such forms of partnership. So those are two elements which I think they do make our relationship quite special. The third point I'd like to mention, of course, diplomats and politicians always tend to exaggerate. There is also a mythological part of it. I think we do have intensive relationships, but many other European countries have quite similar relationship. So partly this special relationship is also a myth, is an exaggeration. We can live with it because I think it serves us on a number of occasions. But I think, as always, there is a true core of it. There might be some exaggerations, but all in all, what counts for us at the end of the day, that we have a constructive and a productive relationship.
Thank you very much, Raphael. You mentioned already how Switzerland's relationship with China relates to the relationship that other European countries have with China. So can you talk about which other countries in the quote unquote West you would look to when it comes to their relationship with China? So who can be sort of a role model for Switzerland in terms of how they're dealing with China? Who do you think is doing an especially good job?
Well, we do not look for a role model. We define our foreign policy on our own, and it has to reflect the specificities of the Swiss interests. There are a number of European countries that have, for instance, published China strategies in the last years. The Netherlands did so, Sweden did, Finland did. Austria is writing one currently. But then, of course, also the big ones. The US, the European Union have also published strategies of how they would like to structure their relationship with China. If you look at them, and I have read all of them, they have a few points in common. First, they all recognize that China is important. China is an important partner politically as well as economically. If you want to solve global problems, you cannot do so without having China on board. Second, China acts according to a system that is different from ours. The Chinese government follows a different set of values than we do. So we have to find ways to cooperate, but in a way that we do not jeopardize our own political goals and values. So we need to create a sort of partnership that reflects these realities. The EU puts it very precisely. They say China is a partner, a competitor, and a strategic rival, and everything at the same time. I think that encapsulates in one sentence basically what it's all about. The US, they do it similarly. If I quote Antony Blinken in the last meeting in Anchorage, he said the US relationship with China should be competitive where it should be. It should be collaborative where it can be. It has to be adversarial where it must be. Switzerland is not the US. We do not have the same instruments at hand. We do not have the same geopolitical role. So probably that is a bit different from our policy. Size does matter if you deal with China. But I think one thing we have to make clear for Switzerland, if we want to contribute to defending the liberal world order from which Switzerland profits very much, Switzerland can do so only by strengthening the multilateral system. So by strengthening the UN, the WTO, the OECD, all the other organizations that do set standards and rules that apply globally, no matter whether your country is big or small. So if Switzerland acts multilaterally, also vis-à-vis China, the advantage is we are not alone. We can join forces with a large number of like-minded countries and thus have far a bigger impact.
I want to talk about Switzerland's China strategy, which has just been published a few months ago. It seems to me that just a few years ago, the prevailing sense in Switzerland was that we don't actually need a China strategy. We have a foreign policy strategy, and thus the argument went we should aim to treat all countries equally under that strategy. Obviously, something has changed, and we now do have a China strategy. It's the only strategy we have that is targeting one country. So in your view, what has changed? Why do we need a China strategy now when we didn't need one 3-4 years ago?
Well, I'd like to challenge that basic assumption. I think Switzerland always had a strategy of how to deal with China. When Max Petitpierre wrote to Mao Zedong in 1950, I think he did it with a plan. So Switzerland already at that time had a strategy, what they want to get out of this newly established relationship with the People's Republic of China. What we did not have is a published paper with the title China Strategy. But I think the predecessors in my job, they always knew what they wanted to achieve in their relationship with China. So what is new since March this year is that we have published a paper where we outlined the China strategy, and we did so publicly so everybody can discuss it. The elaboration of this strategy, of course, brought us broad opportunities to come together with all branches of Swiss government structures and also other partners, because we had to put on paper what we want. It became obvious where we do agree. It became obvious where there are maybe trade-offs, where we have to find solutions to take on board all the Swiss interests, which sometimes are contradicting in nature. So the whole process of writing down a strategy was an important one. It helped us already to achieve greater coherence of Swiss policies. I've mentioned earlier, there are a broad number of actors that do act with China. And maybe that is one of the reasons why we now came to the conclusion the time would be ripe to put things on paper, as there are so many actors that have to be coordinated. because it's quite important vis-a-vis China to act with a coherent approach. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to have any impact on our relationship. So what is novel since March 2021, we have a published paper that can be discussed. It has been discussed in Parliament. It has been discussed in public. It has also been read by the Chinese ambassador and the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and we have received reactions on it. So I think what is new is that we have something on the table that is known, that can be debated, that also makes Swiss foreign policy vis-a-vis China a bit more predictable, because now everybody knows what our guiding frameworks are.
It occurs to me, and this is an argument I've heard from actors in Switzerland as well, that what you just said could very easily be applied to almost any other country that we have a larger relationship with. So how would you respond to people saying, well, if we have a China strategy, why don't we have an India strategy? Why don't we have a Germany strategy? Why don't we have a US strategy? Why don't we have a Pakistan strategy? And of course, you may say, well, we have all these, they're just not published. So why don't we actually go ahead and publish these as well?
That's a good question. I think we are on the way. First thing we have published, and we did so a couple of years ago already, we do it every 4 years, we publish a foreign policy strategy, which basically outlines the main goals, the main targets of Swiss foreign policy. We do it for every legislative period. So it's usually a 4-year strategy. Then deducted from this framework, from these global frameworks, we do formulate regional strategies. Last year, we had published first regional strategies. They relate to the Middle East and to Sub-Saharan Africa. Third one was China. This year, we might publish, and this is in preparation, strategies on the Americas and on Eurasia, including Russia. Next year, we might go on with newer regions. So the plan exists that for the most important regions, for the most important partner countries, we do publish papers that put our interests and our goals are written on a paper. We cannot cover the whole world within a year. That is a process that will take years. And I'm not here to predict how far that will go. If there will be a Pakistan strategy, I rather doubt. I think there is reasons to believe that, let's say, the relationship to China, and I have explained that in the beginning, is of a particular dense and large nature. So a strategy is probably more needed or more urgent than for other countries or for other regions.
Let's look a bit at what the strategy actually says. It seems to me, again, that the strategy is very explicit in its analysis of human rights and freedom of speech issues in China, but then at the same time makes it clear Switzerland is still very interested in a constructive relationship. There are critics who say that this pragmatic approach, if that's what we want to call it, doesn't really work anymore, and that commercial and economic interests cannot be separated from issues like Xinjiang. Why are you convinced that the approach that you've chosen with the strategy is the right approach for dealing with China as a country like Switzerland?
Well, two things. First, yes, it's our goal to have a coherent strategy that addresses all the issues we have in the relationship between China and Switzerland. So yes, fully agree. Situation in Xinjiang, which is concerning, cannot be separated from our economic interests. And that's why the strategy actually englobes both of them and many more. Furthermore, I'm still deeply convinced that there is no trade-off between human rights and business. Actually, the two things, they do not exclude each other. They should be combined and mutually reinforcing. I'm convinced that economic relationship can play a positive role also on development of human rights. And the question is, which are the guiding principles, which are the rules that apply, and which is the regulatory framework that we work in. So yes, fully agree. The two things should be combined, and I don't see a difference between addressing both of them, and we try to englobe both of them. When it comes to the strategy, some people criticized, and we have heard that basically part one of the strategy, which is the description, was very clear in the language and sometimes quite sharp. Part two, when it comes to the measures and the targets, was quite, let's say, pragmatic or constructive. We did so with intention. And that's how foreign policy usually works. I think you need to do things. You need to be clear in your analysis. You should describe the world how it looks like. And you should be sharp in your analysis of the facts. And we have tried hard to do so, to spell it out, and that brought us also some criticism. But then part two, in the implementation of your policy, of course, you need to be respectful with your partner. You need to be constructive. You should focus on areas where jointly you can advance something. If possible, you also should be friendly with your partners in the government of the partner country. That's what we call diplomacy. So I think both we did on purpose. That's probably the best strategy of how to advance our interest in all the fields that we are covering. And I can easily live with critics that highlight these kind of apparent difference, because I think that's our intention.
The impression that is created when we look at just the last few months, since maybe late last year until now, on sort of the global picture and how European countries, the EU, the US are dealing with China, or the way they're talking about China, is that the tone is getting harsher quite quickly. We only have to point to a few things like the sanctions and then the Chinese counter sanctions towards the EU. You yourself mentioned the Anchorage meeting. So when we take this big global picture into account, it seems a bit that the Swiss approach and the Swiss strategy is still more pragmatic, a little bit softer maybe towards China than many of the other countries. Why are we doing that? Is that not a sign that Switzerland's just a little bit behind the curve? Have we just not caught up yet to sort of a more China critical viewpoint that many of our neighbors are espousing? Or are we very clearly trying to distance ourselves from that?
I'm not sure if the Swiss approach towards China is really different from the approaches many other European countries are following. I have mentioned the strategies of Sweden or of Finland, or the one of Austria, which is in the making. I do not see a major black and white difference. I think the approach is similar in a way that there are some elements we criticized, but there are some elements we praise and we cherish. There are some areas which we found that where we can constructively cooperate. And there are other areas where cooperation is more difficult. Maybe in the long run, it will become more difficult than it is today. So I think we are very much in line with many of our European neighboring countries in our approaches. Then there are other countries that do not have written strategies. We can judge them by their policies. I think you find a large variety if you look throughout the European continent, how countries actually treat their relationship with China. I would not say that we are behind the curve or that we are different. Where we are different, and that's what I tried to outline at the beginning, if we are comparing our positions to the one of big countries like the United States, but I think there is a difference. If you represent a major trading bloc, if you represent a major geopolitical power, or if you're rather a middle-sized country with an economy that is dependent from global sets of norms and values. So here I do see a certain difference where Switzerland might be a bit softer in the tone, might be a bit more constructive or pragmatic, if you'd like to call it that way, in its approaches. I think that reflects our size, that reflects the interests of our country that is not part of a major alliance or bloc, and hence is also more fragile or more exposed to eventual pressures from others. So there might be nuances of difference, but I would not exaggerate it. One point which is important, we know where we are in the middle of Europe. We know who our like-mindeds are. Those are mainly our European neighbors. And we know who are our partners when we are defending the liberal world order and the multilateral system of this world from which Switzerland profits so much. Our closest friends and like-minded partners in doing that are our neighbors here in Europe and a couple of other Western countries. And we explicitly say it also in the strategy that those are the countries we coordinate ourselves with, and that will continue to be so.
Yet Switzerland has chosen to not join the sanctions that the US and then the EU have issued against Chinese officials in connection to Xinjiang. And if we look at the Chinese reaction and the counter-sanction that came, that seems to be quite a large difference. So that seems to be more than a nuance in approach. If we consciously, I assume, have decided to not join these sanctions, why have we decided that?
The European Union and a couple of other countries have developed a new mechanism, also a new legal framework to impose sanctions based on human rights and other items, thematic sanctions. And Switzerland currently does not have the legal framework to do similar steps. We do not have the legal basis at the moment. The Federal Council is reflecting on it, and a decision is still not been taken whether we should create such kind of a framework. And then we would be in a position to do similar things. What is clear on sanctions, Switzerland follows all sanctions imposed by the United Nations Security Council automatically. When it comes to sanctions taken by other countries or economic blocs, the Federal Council decides on a case-by-case assessment. In the past, many times, the Federal Council has decided to adopt the same sanctions that the European Union did vis-à-vis other countries. On this case, as I mentioned, it will take more time because we would have to create a legal framework before it. But the decision by the Federal Council is still pending. So we do not have a decision yet whether Switzerland would actually take the same measures or similar measures or measures that would block circumvention of EU sanctions by using Swiss territory. So that's still to come. We'll see.
The official Chinese reaction to the strategy, which was delivered by the Chinese ambassador to Switzerland, was, I dare say, rather harsh. I think at some point he called it fake news. Were you surprised by that reaction, and do you think it has done lasting damage to Switzerland's relationship with China?
I was surprised by the form, by having a press conference called here in Switzerland. That is more unusual. I was less surprised by the content. In our China strategy, the Federal Council has given some qualifications on developments in China. We have mentioned sensitive topics on Xinjiang, on Hong Kong, on the role of minorities, on government structure. So it was to be expected that China would react to these kind of qualifications. And that has happened in a way that I was basically expecting it. So no, we were not surprised about the reactions. Sometimes I think it's helpful to have a frank exchange of views. The Swiss Federal Council stands by its qualifications and by its views expressed. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has voiced their views on the same items, and I think that was a useful exchange. You asked about the diplomatic relations. I think they will continue unchanged. We have not received any indication that there will be a change in our relationships with China as a result of the publication of the strategy.
The strategy, which I think is really interesting, calls for a whole of government and then later on even a whole of Switzerland approach to our relationship with China. What exactly do you mean by that?
Maybe it's important to recall that Switzerland is a very decentralized country with a federalist nature where we have a tradition of taking decisions bottom up. Every village, every city, every university, every private company decides on its own whether to engage in a partnership with an entity far away. There is no such thing as a coordination from a central government on that. That is different in China, as we know. So as we look at things, our relationship with China are intense. They are broad in nature. They are large in its extension. But sometimes it happens that the left hand doesn't, well, maybe does know what the right hand is doing, but is not perfectly coordinated with it. So I think there was a need to better coordinate Swiss policies towards China in order to defend our interests, in order to have a bigger impact. And we starting doing so by writing that strategy that should help us to better understand what others are doing, that should help us to have orientation framework of who is doing what. And that should give us, let's say, the orientation to continue functioning as Switzerland is used to function. So we want to protect the federalist and the bottom-up decision-making system, but federal entities should be able to take their decisions on a background of good information on the geopolitical context where we are in. So that was the idea behind establishing the strategy. The strategy also has given birth to new instruments of coordination. So we have a new founded interdepartmental coordination group where all the 7 departments from the federal administrations are represented and where we discuss ongoing business with China and coming decisions on China. So to make sure that, let's say, at least on the federal level, we are well coordinated. This should be complemented by outreach to other entities where it's more about information sharing with cantons, with cities, with associations, with private actors, to make sure that we have a good flow of information, and that should contribute to a more coherent approach.
The strategy also calls for increasing China competence in Switzerland. How would you define China competence, and in what aspects do you think are we lacking it in Switzerland?
I think there is quite a good knowledge in the industry, in the companies that are invested in China. In the academia, among think tanks, we do have experts on China. I think even on tourism, they have their experts on China and they know how to deal with this large market. So the priority is not so much in creating more knowledge, but probably in connecting those, let's call it pockets of understanding, and in promoting a network among the various stakeholders to see that we can make use of the existing knowledge on China. And I'm quite confident that things are happening bottom up as they did in the past. Once that works, we will see if there are specific gaps we would have to fill. But maybe important, as with the whole strategy, the publication of the strategy is not the end of our reflection on how to deal with China. It's rather the beginning. So we are at the beginning of a discussion process throughout Switzerland, in parliament, in the media, with think tanks, with civil society, with the academia, of how to develop our policy vis-a-vis China and how to develop our capacities of doing so.
We're already coming to the end. We've talked a lot about the Swiss China strategy and what it means. And I've always wondered, does China have a Switzerland strategy? And if it does, what do you think it would say?
I don't know if they have a paper entitled Switzerland Strategy. I can judge by their policy that they have some strategic thinking where they want to have Switzerland, how they view their relationship to Switzerland. But if they have a written strategy, I don't know. And so I guess you would need the Chinese ambassador for your next podcast, and then I would gladly listen.
And what can you derive from the Chinese policies in terms of what their strategic thinking towards Switzerland is?
The partnership we have concluded with China a couple of years ago is called the Innovative Strategic Partnership. So I think China sees Switzerland as a hub of innovation. They would like to establish a close and constructive relationship to participate in innovation and to further develop innovation in their relationship with Switzerland.
All right. Thank you very much, Ambassador Raphael Naegeli, for having joined us today. This was very, very interesting. And I think it was a great conclusion to this podcast series on China and the world. So thank you very much for having been with us today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
And that's it for today. Thank you very much for listening. Here's my recommendation for today: China Global, a new podcast from the German Marshall Fund of the United States. If you enjoyed our series on China and the world and want more, this podcast is a great place to continue. I especially recommend the very first episode, which features an insightful discussion on how China sees Europe, the perfect complement to our conversation here today. This was our final episode of China and the World. If you have not listened yet to the other episodes, I can highly recommend that you do so. And please subscribe and leave us a rating or review on iTunes. It really helps other people find the show. Our next podcast season will launch later this year. Stay tuned. This episode was produced and edited by Denise Staubli. My name is Nico Luchsinger. Have a wonderful summer and see you soon.
Follow Asia Society Switzerland on social media and visit our website for more information on upcoming events.